Okay. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to another table talk. It's a series of conversations we have with academics and writers who are working on animals, animal-human relations, animal environment relationships, and so on. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Harris, my co-host, who will be here in a few minutes. Anu Pandey she also works on similar topics. We aim to bring together academics and writers who are working on human animal relations in India. Today we have with us Jonathan Dickstein, whose essay we're going to be discussing. It's on Jain ethics. We're very grateful to have you here, Jonathan. And I thought and also the talk's going to be recorded, it's going to be up on YouTube. The talk's just for an hour, and it's a really informal conversation. So if you have any questions or comments, please unmute yourself or comment in the chat box. Sometimes people wait till the end and then we just run out of time. I thought we could start the conversation by uh, the some of the introductory comments that you make, and you say that you talk about Western and Christian anthropocentrism, and you say that the Jain perspectives help us think differently. So could you elaborate on that? Hi, Anu.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Susan, for having me, and Anu as well. It's really nice to be here. So so there was a article. I start off this article referencing a very well-known piece by Lynn White called "The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis" from 1967. And really, this piece is basically making the charge that Western Christian anthropocentrism is at the heart of our destruction of the natural world, specifically because it posits a kind of anthropocentrism, which we can talk about. I spend quite a bit of time in the article talking about what we mean by anthropocentrism, but this is of a particular kind where really only human beings have kind of value, and everything is really just in service of human beings. Hence, our use of animals, of the non-animal natural world, are just viewed as kind of use tools, right, for human sustenance and development. And this is really at the heart of, say, ecological degradation. And as a result, a lot of individuals, whether they're environmental activists or animal activists, philosophers, ethicists, have looked towards other kind of religious traditions, also philosophical traditions, but religious traditions to get different orientations. And this has resulted in what we sometimes refer to as the Dharma traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain traditions of ancient India, as ways to look at kind of nature differently, or human beings' relationship to nature, human beings' place among other organisms, and so on. And so oftentimes these religions are viewed as more ecological because they don't have, at least seemingly, the same exact form of anthropocentrism. They do have forms of anthropocentrism, but it seems a little bit less stark, as one might find originally in Christianity or Western Christianity. And so this was a trend in a lot of early scholarship, and then there were people that kind of pushed back against this later. And so my article is called "More Limits in Jain Environmental Ethics" because it's related to a 2002 article by the recently late Paul Dundas, wonderful scholar of Jainism, who wrote a piece called "The Limits of a Jain Environmental Ethic." It was basically saying, okay, I understand why we're looking at Jainism because the Jain slogan, nonviolence is the highest dharma, nonviolence is the highest duty. So, okay, we should have a different relationship towards animals and the environment. But Dundas wants to write, like, not so fast. Let's not be so kind of, I guess the word would be crude in just taking select sutras or slogans from Jainism and then saying, look, this is why we should be vegetarian, or this is why we should be more ecologically conscious. And so I kind of start from there. I'm not really taking up the same questions as Dundas, but really saying what are the limits within Jainism of attributing it to it as this kind of environmentally friendly religion, or what are the limits of its notions of nonviolence?
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. And before we talk about sentience, which is at the heart of your essay, I had another clarificatory question, which is that is it because Jainism is a religion and it's discussing actively what duties one may have, that what the individual can do or who the individual recognizes as sentient is important? Because I know that in the beginning you discuss the ecological model and then you don't you reject that, and then especially in social sciences now, uh, I guess the major theme, so to speak, is entanglement, relationality, and so on. So then is the Jain view, are we looking at it not as a perspective of seeing the world, but more as a what kind of duties you have?
So, as kind of even Dundas notes in the last paragraph of his article, he says that we have to kind of maybe be careful of applying these notions, say, of entanglement and systems theory to a religious tradition that originally emerged around the figure of the ascetic, the individual aspirant who is really seeking their own moksha, right, their own liberation. And now that's a very specific ideal because it relates to ascetics and not as much lay people. But I think the ascetic ideal is really the Jain ideal. Everyone is just kind of not, is aspiring to that. And one way in which this is affected, right, is the ways in which the Jain spiritual path is dedicated to preventing the accrual of karma and the shedding of karma, because these are viewed, we don't have to get too deep into karma theory, but karma in the Jain tradition is viewed as an actual physical substance that affixes itself to the soul, that hinders its, we could say, elevation to liberation. And so Jainism ultimately is concerned is ways in which we act that in a sense, causes this accrual of karma to the individual. That being said, that doesn't mean that other individuals, whether these are human or non-human, have no, how would I say, have no value or don't matter from an ethical standpoint. But that's an additional concern. And so what I think is present in, at least my view, in Jain conceptions of ethics is that it doesn't have as much this kind of relationality, entanglement lens that is common to a lot of human animal relationship literature right now. But it's really concerned with, to say it bluntly, like what's bad? Like what should we not do? What's harm? How do we harm? How much do we harm? Harm is bad. Causing pain is bad. So let's not do that, in other words. So causing pain also causes negative karma, which then hinders the soul's spiritual development. But I would argue that just this kind of notion of suffering, or I like to translate it as unpleasantness, for this word dukkha in Sanskrit, really refers to, I just think they think it's bad. I know it sounds crude, but they just think it's bad.
Yeah, I think Anu and I would agree with that translation. But also to talk about sentience, I thought your definitions of that word, they were very lucid, but also slightly different from what I had associated that word with. Because, when Singer uses it, or just in literature around altruism, to a sentient animal is an animal who has consciousness, and um, that, but you define it slightly differently. Could you tell us how you talk about sentience in the essay?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different aspects of this involved. I refer to sentience as the capacity for affective experience. And what I mean by that is a capacity to feel things pleasantly or unpleasantly. Um, and I apologize in advance. At a certain point, we get at a loss to like what words we're going to use, and we kind of hit a wall, so they might not be everyone's favorite words. But when we talk about consciousness, um, putting aside the question of self-consciousness for a while, like the recognition of oneself as some kind of individual distinct from others, I think there's a difference between phenomenal consciousness and affective consciousness. So a phenomenal consciousness might mean that I'm capable of experiencing phenomenon in the world. And so I give an example of like hearing a church bell or seeing a street lamp illuminate. These are phenomenon, and I can experience that through my sense capacities. I have senses that then relate to some form of a mind, and I experience that. But that experience doesn't need to be pleasant or unpleasant, right? I might not even need to have the capacity to register it as pleasant or unpleasant. But there are other experiences that are affective, whereas maybe that church bell sounds and it's extremely loud and it affects my senses in a way that's extremely unpleasant to me. Unpleasant in the sense that I don't want it to happen anymore. I want to move away from it in some way. I'm using these kind of simple terms because at a certain point, it's hard to say what we mean by bad or unpleasant, which is the sense, but just that I don't want it to continue, right? And so that I would say that's something like an affective consciousness, the capacity to have these experiences of pleasantness or unpleasantness. Also, for the people here, I'd like to say the reason why I like unpleasantness is because things like anxiety and fear and distress, I think, don't get captured by words like pain and suffering. I mean, anxiety can be, we can suffer, but I feel like there are many things like fear that is extremely unpleasant to us, but it's hard to call it pain. So I prefer this other term. So that's the one thing, is that the difference between phenomenal and affective experience. The second is that like harm and pain are not the same thing. So I write this as well, that, you know, you could be under anesthesia and someone can cut your leg with a blade and your body will register this as damage to your body, right? It'll start repairing. But in the absence of your consciousness, there's no pain. Right. So pain is the feeling that is commonly associated with some phenomenal event, and even one that, like damage to your own body, that often is accompanied by pain. But I think it's important to understand that they're separate instances. That kind of being physically harmed isn't pain itself. It is the affective experience that accompanies that event. And if you're unconscious, then there is no pain. So I hope that helps. I hope that's not too too technical, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's really useful. When I was reading the essay, though, I was confused about whether you're also talking about subjectivity, which is something we've been discussing a lot in these table talks. Who is the subject, who has subjectivity, and if you're defining sentience as this kind of affective experience, is that just another word for subjectivity? I mean, again, I understand what you're saying about words and how you run out of words to use, especially if you want to convey different associations through a concept.
I mean, I would ask, what I think subjectivity is harder for me to define. So how would you understand that?
I would define it simply uh, as a person, or seeing somebody as a person able to hold beliefs, opinions, experiences, anything to do again with perhaps the emotional, again, affective aspect of being.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably when we get to the end of that, we agree it's just extremely complicated, right? And I don't like to get into the dry conversations of like, what's a person? Who's a person? Does the person have to have a mind? Does the person have to have conceptions of the past of and the future? Like this kind of notion of themselves existing over time. And so the reason why I say that, just so we don't go too far afield, is that in Jain taxonomies of organisms, Only one group has the kind of mind that can understand itself as living in the past and enduring in the future. So am I to say that only those are subjects? Those have subjectivity, but not all of the other organisms, even though the other organisms have senses and have a mind that can experience? So I don't know. I'm less comfortable deciding who's a subject and who's a not subject. Um, at least in the context of Jainism, we could have another conversation. But I guess I would say that in Jainism, uh, there's only one group, what are called five sensed
Right.
organisms, including humans and some animals, most mammals, birds, fishes, and so on, who have this, what they call a physical mind. It's a weird, kind of a somewhat bizarre term, but a certain kind of mind that is distinct from those of other organisms, in which it is possible to conceive of oneself existing over time.
Right. And when I read that, I was thinking about the Cartesian division between the mind and the body, but is the physical, that distinction kind of the opposite of that? Because if you have the physical mind, then you're supposed to be more advanced in the Jain cosmology, right?
Yes. The question then becomes, right, so kind of maybe for those who haven't seen the article, I think what's important at the beginning of what I'm trying to understand is in Jainism, like what matters foundationally, right? So I use this language of intrinsic value. What has intrinsic value? And and if we can locate that somewhere, then it's something that we need to care about or we need to consider when we act. And this is like different than someone like Descartes, who's really trying to separate the mind body and then saying things about animals that they're just bodies and hence they don't matter at all, right? These animal machines, as Descartes refers to them. And so I make the case that unpleasantness and pleasantness have um, intrinsic value and disvalue in Jainism. I think this is across, I think in Buddhist texts and Hindu texts, you can find this as well. Um, and then the case is, okay, if that's the case, then we have to find out what kinds of organisms have the capacity for unpleasantness. And the thing is, in Jainism, all organisms have the capacity for unpleasantness. So the case that I would make, this is according to the Jain worldview, is that while there is still a hierarchy, there is still a level of sophistication among organisms that impacts how much we need to care about organisms. But in the Jain worldview, all organisms down to microplants have the capacity, the affective capacity to feel unpleasantness, and hence they matter. And this is what makes it in stark distinction from a Western Christian anthropocentrism that is not just saying that plants don't matter, but is really saying that even other animals don't matter beyond their use value for humans.
And this is closely connected to ahimsa as well, right? Because if we expand and you work with that figure of the circle, and I thought that was a really great, I could imagine it visually when you say that not everyone is sitting at equidistant from the circle on the same kind of seats. So then if we are even as we expand the circle, we extend ahimsa to all of those beings equally. Could you tell us a bit about this connection between ahimsa and sentience that you're making in the essay?
So ahimsa, non-harming, I think is probably a better translation than non-violence, is hard is on the one hand it's extremely commonsensical and on the other hand complicated. I always give the story of my colleague who once told his mother, his Gujarati mother, he said, "I'm teaching a class on non-violence." And she said, "What's there to teach? How could you possibly teach a whole term on it? Like it's such common sense." But ethically speaking, it's pretty complicated because you have to locate, say we say non-harming, we have to define what harm is, and then kind of explain why harming is bad in a sense, and then where harm exists in the world, like who is possible of being the victim of harm, right? So I first like to make the case that just to keep it short, that in a lot of Jain literature and other literature, when you do good things in the world, meritorious acts, you usually receive kind of pleasure or pleasant experiences as a result. And when you do bad things, you suffer in a certain way from it. And if that's the case, then it does seem like pleasantness and unpleasantness have kind of intrinsic value and disvalue respectively. Because it would be strange. It would be strange to do a bad act and be punished with unpleasantness if unpleasantness wasn't bad or something that you're trying to avoid, right? We can have a long conversation about whether or not suffering has instrumental value or unpleasantness like instrumental value. Like I deprive myself and undergo pain to help me elevate in some spiritual way, but that's a different question. And so I come from the position, and this comes a lot through early Jain texts of kind of Mahavira, this kind of founder of Jainism, let's just say it that way, insight into the world, who in a state of omniscience looks out into the world and understands that all organisms don't want to die. They experience fear. They want to live. They want to experience pleasure. And I would say that what happens there is this fundamental understanding, and that generates a kind of kinship with these other beings, because we can understand that ourselves and also don't want these negative feelings. One might say that this then generates a feeling of compassion, karunya in Jainism. And then I would say that kind of compassion gives rise to an ethic later on as a vow, a vrata of nonviolence, which basically says, because unpleasantness, because suffering should be prevented, and now I recognize that all of these organisms experience it, I have a duty to prevent it as much as possible. This is similar, actually. I mean, Peter Singer says something, I don't know if I'm saying it, quoting verbatim. He says, suffering is suffering no matter who is the experiencer of that suffering. Now, that's true in one sense, but Jainism will also say that not all sufferings kind of matter evenly. So just because all beings suffer in a certain sense, as I use the term moral significance, beings have different moral significance, meaning that, say, causing harm to a fig tree is not the same as causing harm to a koala, right? But that being said, at the very beginning, the vow of ahimsa applies to all of them, which is why Jain ascetics have very strict vows when it comes to they're not to use electricity, they're not to boil water because of the effects that it has on microorganisms. A lot of Jain ascetics wear the mupati, the mouth guard, to prevent the ingestion of small insects and other organisms. But for lay people who take the anuvrata or the lesser vows, then the vow of ahimsa mostly covers animals, not really plants.
Anu, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Susan. Hi, Jonathan. I had a couple of questions as well. Um, First of all, because you just mentioned the idea of moral significance, which I found really fascinating in your work as well. The way you make a distinction between sort of inherent worth and moral significance. So I just wanted to ask you to maybe speak a little about this, about what you understand between these two, under these two. And then, how does one approach? Because you just gave us the example of the fig tree and the koala, where, one is sort of like plant life and the other one is an animal. But how would one approach beings like, let's say, microbes? I don't know, something that whose inherent worth is easier to understand and perceive, but whose moral weight or moral significance isn't that easily, obviously, or immediately discernible.
Yeah, those are great questions. First off is the question of moral significance, right? At the beginning of the article, I give some definitions, which on some days, if I was reading an article like that, I would just close the window immediately and say, this is boring. I'm going to move on to something else. But I feel like when you write articles about ethics, you have to have a common vernacular, or it doesn't work. There's so many, and we can use these terms differently. So to say it as quickly as possible, or at least hopefully as clearly as possible for everyone here, is basically I start with the idea that we have things of intrinsic value and disvalue. And since the conversations a lot of the time is about bad things, about suffering, not about pleasure, we'll just stay there. So I say that, and we've talked about this already, that unpleasantness has intrinsic disvalue. It's bad. We don't want it. We have a duty to prevent it. However, I give the example that Christopher Fremerin gives about his dog and says, look, if I have to care about the unpleasant state of my dog, while in a technical sense, I'm really concerned with the unpleasantness that my dog experiences, but that unpleasantness is associated with my dog as a whole. So I have to just like care for my dog. I can't care for the unpleasant dog experience kind of separate from the entity. So then I say that inherent worth refers to the organism that is associated with these states. So in Jainism, that would be microbes up to humans, actually to gods and hell beings as well. That I just have to consider them because I can't consider their kind of affective states independent of them as a whole. And then I use the term moral significance that refers to the kind of weight of an organism's inherent worth relative to another organism. So to go to Susan's point, the idea is that if we have kind of a circle of inherent worth, the beings that maybe are closer to the center have the greatest moral significance. Now, anthropocentrism usually posits human beings at the center of that circle uncritically, right? And I think this is kind of a common reflex of a lot of people in not just in kind of Western philosophy as well. It's just this idea that if anyone has worth, human beings have worth. But that actually has to be demonstrated, right? We can't just take that at face value. So the question then becomes for moral significance is if the center is where you have the most moral significance, say we have to consider you for whatever reasons we want to kind of debate about, then as you get closer to the circumference of that circle, then you have less moral significance. Which doesn't mean you don't matter. It just can mean that kind of the weight of your mattering isn't as strong. Now, I want to caution anyone that this doesn't, the reason why this has been a problem is because if we assume humans are at the apex of value, then people often assume that the more that other animals or organisms are like humans, then the more moral significance they have. But I think we should kind of jettison that notion altogether. What we have to understand is what we actually think has the most value for whatever reason. And that can be any organism, right? So I give the kind of cheeky example of the like chess playing raccoon in the article, which is basically like, if we say that having, for example, I'm not making this argument, but if we say that having the ability to have self-consciousness and use tools and use language and all these things that generally kind of characterize a lot of humans have give us the strongest moral significance, then any organism that satisfies those should have just as much moral significance. A raccoon, a special raccoon, an artificial intelligence, an extraterrestrial, right? So this is why we should just move away from the notion that it's being like human. The question really should just be, what do we think has the greatest moral significance and which beings satisfy that? But I want to be clear that I'm not making an argument for what actually should be that, but that's the kind of general term. And lastly, I know I'm kind of going long on this, but your question was about microbes. I think what's important, and I referenced this at the end of the piece, is kind of what Ronald Sandler says, where he says, we might have duties to microbes or nigoda in Jainism, but it just might be either impossible, like we can't actually function in the world by taking their existence into account, or it might be just so impractical that we can't do it. And we could recognize that as a kind of ethical failing in a way, even if it doesn't change our behaviors.
I had one more question. So it's really interesting to my mind also, and this goes back to a few childhood memories I have of friends in school when I was a little kid. These two sisters who came from a Jain family, and we went for a couple of sleepovers to their place and kind of got to see their lives, their families, their homes, as well as, there would be a visit to the temple in the evening, and they took us along. And some members of the family were practicing Shwetambar Jains. So, dressed in white, also with the white cloth on the mouth. And it was the first time we got to see anything of the sort. And my sister and I were curious and we wanted to know what this was for. And they told us. And that memory kind of stuck with me. And now, reading your essay, talking to you about this right now, and you just mentioned the little mouth covering as well. And I think that it is a really modern sort of idea that way back at the beginning of Jainism, the founding fathers and mothers, so to speak, thought about the possibility of there being organisms which are alive, which the naked eye can't see, but you take into consideration the fact that there could be such organisms, although there was probably not yet any scientific evidence to suggest that there were creatures that existed and to whom we owed a certain moral consideration or should feel that we owe it to them, even though for all practical purposes, they don't exist for us. We can't see them, we can't smell them, we can't touch them. And I find that sort of modern and progressive in Jainism because, to my understanding, there is not something comparable in the other religions that I know of. Very, very minimally, I must agree, but still. Um, and then I'm interested in knowing how, to what extent would you say Jainism has evolved, given the fact that our understanding of our environment and the creatures we share this environment with is transforming constantly. Not just right now in the 21st century, but over the last so many centuries, all the things that one has discovered that one was completely clueless about. Does does the ethics or the ethical stance that Jainism takes vis-a-vis other organisms, vis-a-vis what our behavior should be as parts of this environment, how much of a change, how much of a transformation, adjustment has Jainism undergone? Um, Perhaps as compared to other religions which have not changed very much in that sense. And because Jainism seems so progressive, I wonder if in the thinking, in the writings, in the preachings, a certain shift or a certain further expansion of this, this idea of we owe moral consideration to others, whether that has been reflected with the changing times.
Thank you for that reflection. And it's a great question, and probably could spend another hour just talking about that. Because I think this is a challenge across traditions. As I also reference Roger Jackson's typology in this piece about how we have this kind of whole spectrum across traditions, from like literalists kind of believe the absolute, I'm going to say dogma of a religion, because it really means things that are unchallengeable by kind of any science or research. It's just because it's part of the tradition in a scripture, it's accepted as truth, right? To secularists who decide that actually a lot of the claims that are being made from earlier religions, dogma, are not just unconvincing, but probably false, and hence we need to learn from them in a secular context. And this is why people for many years or at least many ways why Buddhism was packaged, right, as like a philosophy, not a religion, or Jainism is a philosophy, not a religion, because it seems to kind of be more amenable. So I think it's across, I wouldn't say, I think there are progressive strains in Jainism, but there's a lot of conservatism in Jainism. I mean, religion by its very nature is conservative. It just almost has to be. And so I would say, so it's across the spectrum. What I find to be interesting, what I point out, and I think it's important to highlight in this conversation, is I think that what's interesting is what happens when Jainism has to deal with the fact that even though it has seemingly recognized the existence of microscopic organisms, at least in some way before they had any scientific ability to locate them, that Jainism is making the case that certain animals, plants, and microorganisms have actual minds and the capacity to feel things. The question is, what happens when our modern science states that most likely this isn't the case, regardless if they exist or not, right? So also the claim that microplants exist is really hard to say. What we know as microorganisms is what the Jains were talking about. But the question is, what happens when we have no good reason to think, say, oysters have feelings of pleasantness or unpleasantness, or plants or grass? Then the question I ask is how does Jainism respond to that? This is actually more of the fundamental question of the article, right? Is how does Jainism respond to that? And is Jainism actually built on sentience, or is it built on something else? Right. So I applaud Jainism because I think it really, at least from some respect, dovetails a lot of contemporary environmental and animal ethics, like these kind of sentientist trends that are saying, let's stop thinking about humanism or animalism, but really we should be concerned about, say, sentience. So I think that's a good move. But a lot of environmental ethicists, and I think certain strains in Jainism as well, say that actually sentience is too robust. It's too much of a high bar for entry. And actually, I'm just saying organisms could have inherent worth, even if they're non-sentient. And that's a very complicated topic, but I appreciate how it recognizes what being a strict sentientist might mean for our relationship to, say, the non-animal world.
Krishnanvi, go ahead. I can't hear you.
Hi, thank you for a very fascinating conversation. I just wanted to ask about how the idea of Jainism and its regard for animals of various kinds, how that also interacts with the social in a certain sense. That I'm also thinking of, you're talking about nonviolence in its definition that you give, and the vrata of nonviolence that that is evolved in Jainism. One also understands that this vrata can be or this vow of nonviolence may also be can be taken only by people who are allowed by allowed socially, or who have the privilege, to use a very cliche term, or who are allowed by the system to take that vrata, right? That they are able to be non-violent because they have the space to not have to visit violence upon the different kinds of animals, right? Now, if that is the case, then I was also just curious about how Jainism considers people who may be polluted by the burden of inflicting or imposing this violence upon animals, whether they choose to or not. I am mostly thinking of from Hinduism, where the Chandala or the dog eater is looked at in a very certain way as a polluted being in that sense. So at the same time, the Chandala is also forced to carry off the corpse of the cow as well, right? So how does Jainism look at humans as well, who are located within this violence, that as a religion it also disavows in that sense?
Thank you so much for that question. So I think the backdrop to your question is really like, what is Jainism's relationship to things like caste historically in many ways? And while on the surface, right, Jainism and Buddhism have, they kind of, let's just say the talking point is the rejection of caste, right? This is seemingly one of the markers of Jainism and Buddhism vis-a-vis what has come to be known as Hinduism, right? Which is also a very difficult topic of Hinduism. But, we know that historically Jains have practiced caste, have operated within caste systems, and so have Buddhists. So on the ground, it looks a lot different. Certainly, there is a way in which proximity to violence is an issue. This is why, for example, ascetics won't boil water, but they will have someone else boil the water for them. So there's this kind of notion that I keep myself kind of, James Laidlaw once called Jainism the ethic of quarantine. Ahimsa, ethics of quarantine. Like I'm trying to quarantine myself off from others. So I think your question, I think there's traction there, right? How much do we keep ourselves clean and then allow others to accumulate kind of certain forms of pollution? But in a way, I'm sure the argument could be made that there's a form of merit that these lay people are accruing that then accelerates, or let me say assists their rebirth closer to this ascetic ideal. So I think there's a way in which we understand that there's certain forms of harm that are not just unavoidable, but also that certain groups, based on the kind of their karmic situation, means that they are in a situation where they need to remove carcasses, for example, or prepare food, or do a host of other things. And this has also been a very tricky issue across these traditions, is what is karma responsible for and not, right? My station in life and so on, and the tasks I have to do. There was one more aspect of the question that I think I kind of, also I just wanted to say that, yes, there's a certain amount of like privilege in the sense of who can take certain vows formally, but the kind of anuvrata or lesser vows in Jainism, I think we refer to them as vows. I think that's important, but they are just kind of guiding principles and practices, mostly practices for anyone. So then the question is, does it take privilege to practice nonviolence? Well, I don't think it takes privilege to adopt it as an aspiration. I think it takes a certain amount of privilege to be able to perfect it or come closer to perfecting it. And why don't we allow more people the ability to practice it? Why don't we change systems to allow people to remove themselves from institutions of harm? All of us? Well, yes. I mean, these are vital questions that I think should be addressed by Jainism and anyone.
So in that sense, just as a follow-up to the first part of your answer, that is there a strain of thought which is anti-caste within Jainism itself? Because if we are to position ourselves against caste consciousness, then we doesn't necessarily have to mean that we'll also have to position ourselves as, or we'll also have to reject the karmic theory as a whole, because will the karmic theory also be legitimizing or justifying the fact that one is born into a certain caste, and therefore one cannot really aspire to any kind of a non-violence at all, because the very karma that one has accrued through the cycle of reincarnations is that it has put one in close proximity to violence in that sense. Is there at all an anti-caste strain of thought possible within Jainism?
Yes, I mean, I think if you talk to especially most diasporic Jains, so I'm in the United States and I deal mostly with Jains in diaspora, are usually not, you ask them about caste, these are kind of mostly anti-caste folks, at least on the surface, and younger Jains that I speak to in the United States are as well. Many, I can't tell you if they accept karmic theory or not. And also there's a sense in which karmic theory, this is complicated, is not responsible for everything, right? There's certain things that karma dictates and certain things that it doesn't. And so I think this is very present. But once again, I would say that I think we look at nonviolence as aspirational, as an ideal, and even ascetics themselves are trying their best to kind of get closer and closer to that. what that actually means is challenging. What you actually do in the world, how much are you self-centered on kind of quarantining yourself from karma, and whether that's socially responsible, that's more challenging. But it's just for a longer conversation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Bharat, do you want to go next?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Jonathan. So one of your quote is that Jainism is a philosophy, not a religion, right? And I'm not
No,
not in a position.
I'm not. I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
So I'm
I'm
not in a
saying.
position to verify or falsify that quote. But one thing which I believe is that one of the vows or anuvrat is ahimsa, right? So in ahimsa, so the practice of ahimsa we see in Jivdaya. The word Jivdaya. So so I am writing a paper on Jivdaya, and so my point here is that yes, as an anthropologist, I can see that since it's not Jain, but Hindus are also practicing Jivdaya, and they are taking inspiration from this Jain philosophical concept called Jivdaya, right? Or Ahimsa is the larger umbrella, but Jivdaya is the word which they are catching. So Hindus are also now in a practice of Jivdaya, right? And Jivdaya we can see in practices. For example, I did my fieldwork in Gujarat. So, so when the cows are smuggling, the argument of Jivdaya comes in the domain. But what I can see right now is the violent vegetarianism, which is also going on. So my question here is that any Jain text talk about can you preach violently these vows, all the anuvrats? Is there any text which says that okay, you can go at certain extent or not? Like it's just a question because I'm anthropologist and not a
No, this is great. I also appreciate this, and I think this is a wonderful topic that I don't know if Yamini has been on the table talk before. Yamini Narayanan, who's a dear colleague and friend of mine, who I think her book, her recent book that just came out is wonderful and touches a lot on this. Is that and I've actually had a student who was writing recently on Palitana and beef bans and Palitana among the Jains there. And what Yamini writes about and others and I've written about is that the fundamental problem, right, is one of the fundamental problems with vegetarianism and strictly enforced vegetarianism and beef bans is that it doesn't address the root problem, right, which is that all of these bovines or most of these bovines exist for dairy industries in India. And the same individuals who are committing forms of violence against those who are not practicing vegetarians are the same individuals who are promoting the exact industry that makes the bovines present and in need of disposal, right? You can't have a dairy industry that is not a slaughter industry on a mass scale, right? It's just impossible. And so this is a very new but very, very what's the word I want to say, potent discussion in the Jain community right now is about the use of dairy, not just for its effects on cows, but how it relates to these other forms of violent vegetarianism and so on that you see, maybe not amongst Jains, but among Hindus in India, and how that's related to nationalism, how it's related to Islamophobia, how it's related to casteism, and so on. And I think this is becoming a very, very interesting debate because you even have more and more acharyas and so on in India who are Jain acharyas who are trying to move dairy out of the Jain community, right? And what we don't know historically is that Jains Jain monks and nuns were prohibited from travel, and really only in the last half century have individuals actually traveled outside of India, and most guidance comes from the monks and nuns, right? In the diaspora, in Europe, in the United States, there are really very few monks and nuns that have ever been there to teach, and hence that kind of chain of authority doesn't really exist. So we think with the influx of animal rights, of environmental ethics, of concerns about how human rights and animal rights and environmental rights are intertwined, then there are these critiques of strictly enforced vegetarianism. for the example that I gave, because the industry also kind of, dairy industry, for example, just generates so many cows that then have to be disposed of, but also related to the question received before, which is that a lot of people don't have access, don't have the ability to practice in that way. So do we not have a responsibility to change structural conditions to then make it possible for more people to practice that ethic?
Just a follow-up question. I'm not sure whether I can see the dairy product in the diet of the Jain monks or nuns. So which is I think I have to explore. But I can see. I just want to give example on the violent vegetarianism aspect. Is that in MP or in the central India, the Jain monks are advocating replacing eggs with cow milk. So they are advocating dairy product so to replace the egg. So just a point. Yes, that's all. Thank you.
I think this is a great example, and if you read anyone who reads the article, it's a kind of extremely interesting because we have to make the case of why eggs are bad or why milk is bad, and in the Jain tradition, it's typically because the egg itself. It's about the egg itself, right? It's not about the fact that there's a form of, say, theft or harm done the chicken when you breed them and take their eggs. There's actually harm done to the egg itself, to the organism that is the egg itself. Now, modern science might say, like, there's no harm being done because, as I said earlier, there's no experience of that egg. There's no something that we can locate as intrinsically valuable or disvaluable. If one wants to make the case that the harm is done to the chickens from whom the eggs are taken, then you run into an interesting point, because if we're replacing eggs with milk, then the same argument can be made about the milk, right? And while it's beyond the confines of this discussion, I think a lot of it, the reason why milk is preferred is, right, is we have this long-standing trope in India of not just the sacred cow, but the cow who gives, the cow who is mother. And what this means is that if a cow gives milk, then there's no harm taking place. And I think this really much kind of fuels into why milk is a non-harmful industry. But you read Yamini's work, you read people like Catherine Gillespie and many others, and you kind of realize how terrible those industries actually are.
Yeah, actually, we had both Gillespie and Yamni on Table Talks before. And since we're almost out of time, I thought we'd just give you a minute to talk
Sure.
about vitality, because, that's the kind of shift you make, right? From this sentiocentric model to talking about vitalities of organisms. So could you just tell us a bit about that?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I almost was going to interject it myself, because I think folks would leave this talk being like, Jainism is about sentience, and that's what Jonathan is arguing. But what I actually write in the piece is that if you look in texts like the Tadvarta Sutra, which is an authoritative text for both Digambara, Shvetambara Jains from the first few centuries of the Common Era, it has a definition of violence, which is, say, the deprivation of vitality owing to carelessness. And this term vitality refers to prana. And that's interesting, because if the deprivation or the destruction of prana is himsa, right? And it says owing to carelessness, but let's just kind of, which means like pramatta, but let's put that aside for a moment. If harm is actually the destruction of the vitalities or the prana, then we're not really talking about sentience foundationally. And what that means, prana in Jainism, it means that there are life forces such as lifespan, life duration, respiration, and so on, that exist independent of any kind of sense experience or affective capacity. So why do I mention this? Is because in a lot of environmental literature, we talk about we need to care about individuals that are alive, or we need to care about the living world. But we still need to understand what living means. And I would say in Jainism, if we're talking about what's alive, things that are alive are things that have pranas, that have at least one of these 10 vitalities. And there are vitalities that are more rudimentary than sense experience. And so if the traditional Jain definition, which is in the Tattvartha Sutra, but other texts, is about vitalities and not about causing dukkha, then maybe, as I said earlier, the standard for entrance into this moral circle isn't sentience, but whether or not you are a vital organism or not. Now, that might all sound kind of ethereal in a sense, but this is actually not too distinct from people like Ronald Sandler, who I talk about, and others in environmental ethics that actually make this argument, that they make the argument that there are many non-sentient organisms who are teleologically organized, or they're goal-directed, or they live lifespans that proceed towards flourishing, and that flourishing is good, is a good thing. It's something that we should encourage, not encourage its destruction, even if that organism is non-sentient. Now, I'm not saying that that's plausible, and I'm not saying that it's or that it's right, or that the Jain conception is right. But ultimately, I ask the question is, and this goes back to Anu's point, is that if contemporary Jainism wants to seriously engage with science and ethology and biology, how does it deal with the fact that most of the conclusions there are going to say that plants are non-sentient, that microscopic organisms are non-sentient, and even some animals like bivalves, like mussels and oysters, are non-sentient? What does Jainism do? And I usually say that I give two examples, but there's actually three choices. White literalists of the Jain tradition can say, we don't care. We actually don't view these findings as authoritative, because only Tirthankaras or Jinnas or Mahavira is omniscient, and they know these are just infallible humans tinkering in science, and it's much more fallible. So that's a literalist perspective, which might not satisfy people who are more involved in critical reflections on these issues. And then I say that, okay, Jainism has two choices. If it's going to say that only sentience matters, that only this affective experience matters, then it might have to think differently about its inclusion of some animals, plants, and microbes from its kind of sphere of moral concern. Right? I don't think that's as plausible or as maybe consistent as the second option, which I say, which is to lower its bar, at least in common discourse, about what beings matter, and say, actually, I don't have to prove to you that plants are sentient. I just have to show you that they have something akin to a prana or a vitality. And in line with current streams in environmental ethics, these individuals matter because they are goal-directed in a certain way. Now, coming back to Anu's point, I don't know what that actually practically means in what our actual responsibilities are to them, like how much we actually have to take them into account. So that's one challenge. And the only other second challenge which I flag is someone still has to argue, Ronald Sandler, whoever else has to argue as to why that matters, why just something being alive commands a kind of moral consideration. And I don't really know the answer to that. I'll be honest with you, Susan. I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is I feel differently when I step on a rock and when I step on grass. Even if I don't think that grass is sentient, I actually have a feeling that's different. And I oftentimes reflect on why I think so.
Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I know we've just run out of time, but very, very quickly to respond to what you were now saying, because you talked about the rock versus the grass. And I understand what you mean by, stepping on grass and feeling a certain way, and stepping on a rock and feeling a different way. But I live in Hyderabad, and one of the things that we cry about in this city is the fact that it had all of these billions of years old rocks all over the place, which have been blasted away for constructing, spaces for humans to live in, work in, build their factories, etc. Now, a rock is a rock. but it has history. And my heart bleeds when I see that where there was a huge rock, now it's been blown to smithereens and there's nothing left.
Mm.
The rock is not sentient. The rock does not have the same kind of prana or vitality that, let's say, grass has or a plant has. But the rock is something that has evolved over billions of years, grown in a way. You know what I mean by grown here, right?
Yes.
And I wonder, this is something I've been wondering about for a long time, looking at and following these debates about whom do we owe this sort of moral consideration to? What should be the criteria for determining whether it's sentience, whether it's something else, whether it's their value to us? And I just wonder, um, why can't we orient this according to what we owe to our own morality, in the sense of this idea of not destroy, not break, not do harm, regardless of whether the object that we are speaking about of our actions is alive or not, is capable of feeling pain or not, capable of feeling joy and sorrow or not, capable also of realizing its destruction or not. Because I believe that when we destroy, we also destroy a part of ourselves, right? I mean, we are inflicting a certain kind of violence when we are destroying. And again, there are limitations to this thought because, of course, I have trees in my garden and every now and then they need pruning because otherwise it's a jungle. Um, and we do that. I feel a little pang, but I do it. But it's it's what I'm trying to say is, instead of orienting our behavior or our moral consideration for other entities according to what those entities can feel, would it not be a possibility to think about orienting it according to what it does to us or what it makes us feel? And if it makes us feel like we are being destructive or violent, then perhaps it is something we need to stop doing or tone down or, at least think about.
I find that, I mean, obviously, it's certainly plausible the way in which our actions affect us. Sometimes when I think of ethics, I view it also as like our gaze turned outward is mostly when I think of ethics. What do we owe others, right? Kind of instead of, I find that when individuals talk about animal rights or food ethics, things like environmental ethics, it's almost like finding ways in which we don't have to have moral responsibility to others. Like people want to talk about why beings don't matter, why actually this doesn't matter, and I can continue to live in very relatively extravagant ways. And what I find what's also a massive value, right, in Jainism is this kind of, at least the ascetic ideal is one of minimalism, aparigraha, right, non-accumulation. And I find that I can't, I think we can actually have a disposition towards rocks that make us not want to destroy them. And so I generally think, like, when you go out into the world, like, how much can we practice kind of non-destruction, even if we're not sure exactly about the nature of our responsibilities to other organisms. And then the question becomes, like, how much do I need to do this thing? Is this thing that I'm going to do, whether it's to get on an airplane or build something or buy something, is it actually really generative to my happiness or flourishing? Or is it just like, I want another latte and, it's going to give me, and don't get me wrong, I love a good latte, but I'm just saying there are many things in which we're trying to continue, right, some paradigm or some kind of cycle of consumption that we ultimately know doesn't really bring us a kind of satisfaction. And we started off, Susan and I started off talking, and she had quoted the piece by Bab that I quote in the article, which is just like this terrible depiction of the world. Like the whole world is just a never-ending misfortune and calamity. And while I'm not one to say that's what living's all about, I do think there's a way in which we engage in a lot of frivolous destruction. and I don't need to have an academic argument about whether grass matters or whether a tree matters, to just try not to cause it destruction if I don't have to. Granted, that's my own, this is kind of me speaking for myself right now, and I don't want to speak for Jainism. But yes, I'm less interested in arguing why rocks don't matter, as in talking about maybe we can engage in more preservation than destruction overall.
All right. That brings us to the end of the session. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for engaging with us and responding to our questions. It's been great to talk about Jainism and really learn more about some of these concepts. Thanks so much. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to end the session now. Bye, everyone.